This color mismatched monstrosity is my Windows XP retro gaming PC. It works beautifully currently for all the games I want to play from the 90s through the 2000s. It's running well, and there's really no need to mess with it. But I really can't help myself, so let's tinker with it. I really love PC gaming from the 90s and 2000s, and messing around with hardware from the mid 2000s is a lot of fun for me. And this is basically my retro season. See, I live in a place where I clear the snow off of my car at the end of a workday, drive home, and the next morning, my car looks like this. When the temperatures are below freezing, the snow's fallen, it's the perfect time to cozy up and mess around with these old games again. Today we're going to benchmark the system at stock. It has a Q6600 CPU and an 8800 GT GPU. We're going to take some measurements in a few of our favorite games, then we're going to overclock the graphics card and processor to the max that they will remain stable on this very modest, subpar overclocking machine, using only the simplest methods that you could repeat at home, and just see how much extra juice there is to squeeze out of a modest overclock in terms of performance, while remaining perfectly stable. Originally, this video was also supposed to include a CPU upgrade from the venerable Q6600 to the much more powerful Q9550 that I bought on eBay for $10, but unfortunately the Q9550 I received is cursed and bricked 5 consecutive Windows XP installations. A lot of blue screens and wasted footage, definitely not still salty about that, but oh well, maybe we can explore that another time. For now, let's get into some benchmarks. First up, a favorite of mine and a very demanding game, Oblivion. Got everything pretty well cranked up here. Most of the settings turned on. You can see I do prefer the bloom over the HDR, and I did go all the way up to 8x anti-aliasing. This will be a pretty demanding run. Let's see how it does. This is a super demanding scene here, and apologies in advance if you hear some whispering in the background. That's my daughter playing with her toys while I try and squeeze in some recording, but Oblivion's a weird one to try and benchmark. The mandatory menus, like with lockpicking to get through certain parts of the game, tend to skyrocket the average FPS, but we're going to do some scene-by-scene comparisons later just to see in specific spots how it compares, and I also am going to pay particular attention to the 1% lows, as those stutters are kind of what Oblivion is sort of famous for, and I want to see if the overclock picks that up a bit. Kind of an interesting result here. You can actually see what looks like the game being juggled between the different cores a little bit, and maybe even a snippet of some early attempts at multi-core optimization. Could also just be MSI Afterburner and stuff running, but it sort of looks like it's spread across the cores. Interesting to see something like that this early. I am going to show some graphs at the end for comparison, but we ended up with an average across a few runs of 195, with 1% lows around 21. Next game up is Fear. This is a fun one to play in a dark basement by yourself. I love this game because it is very demanding. It's an awesome game, but it also has its own built-in benchmarking tool. So not only can we compare the MSI Afterburner results head-to-head, but also the benchmark tool's results. So we'll get 2 sets of data to take a look at. Game is favoring one core, no surprises there. Pretty much every single game from this era and well beyond this era for quite a while. Always did, but we do have soft shadows on. I'm sure you saw that in the menu settings. Everything else is basically maxed out. Game's still holding up great. I'm excited to compare this against the overclock result to see how much extra we get. Here's the end of the benchmark run. In MSI Afterburner, we were getting a very consistent average of 161 with a 1% low of 59. And the snapshot here of the benchmark result we can compare against the overclocked result at the end. Slightly lesser known title here. This is King's Bounty Warriors of the North. And if you know anybody that doubts the image quality of CRT monitors, just show them this menu screen. Should make a believer out of them. I mean, just the sharpness, color, contrast. And this is just my phone pointed at the screen. It looks much better in person, if you can believe that. Settings are again maxed out, 1280 by 960 resolution for all the games. That's just the maximum resolution for my monitor that it will do at 70 Hz. And of course, VSync is off. We're just running around in the initial camp here, as it's fairly demanding and easily repeatable. Maxing out the single CPU core again, no surprises there. What was a little bit of a surprise was the RAM usage is pretty high, over 1400 megabytes at times, and the video memory. The 256 megabyte graphics cards would struggle here, as we are beyond that at points. Since it is fairly demanding, I'm expecting a decent boost from an overclock on this one. When all was said and done here, we ended up with an average of 115 FPS with a 1% low of 72. Okay, last game at stock settings, then we'll jump into the overclocking. This is Need for Speed Underground 2, definitely a popular game. We're going to keep this one muted, as I learned in my last Windows XP video that this has some music that's copyrighted. You can see we got the level of detail slider all the way up, so everything's basically maxed out, same resolution, VSync is off. This is another demanding game with all the lighting effects and fast-paced action. You can see what I mean in the last game by the RAM and especially the video memory usage. Way lower here. It's not like we're getting hundreds of frames per second or anything, just way less loaded into the buffer there. But you can see this is another game that looks like it's kind of trying to use more than one CPU core, and it's jumping around a bit, so I'm curious what the overclock's going to do here. I'm expecting big gains again. Alright, we've had our fun at stock settings. Now it's time to take this thing
even further beyond!
Alright, I'm sorry, I don't know what's wrong with me. So we're applying a very modest overclock to the CPU here, bumping it up to 3 GHz. That's the highest I can get any chip to go on this motherboard. Some built-in limitation maybe, but should be easily replicated at home. Even if your motherboard doesn't overclock, you can actually do something called a tape mod, where you literally stick tape in a couple spots on the bottom of the CPU. For the Q6600, it will go up to 3 GHz, even if your motherboard doesn't support overclocking. So easily replicated at home, and 3 GHz is still a 25% speed increase over the 2.4 base clock, so we should see a decent performance lift here. Next up, we're moving on to MSI Afterburner. This is the software we were using to put all those numbers on screen for benchmarking and the stock benchmarks. It's also usable to overclock your graphics card. At base, our graphics card is running at about 626 megahertz on the core and 900 megahertz on the memory. I tried at first to be a little aggressive and get the core to 702 megahertz and the memory to 999 megahertz, but that did not work out, kept freezing. So I just bumped it down step by step, and I'll put the final stable highest measurements I was able to get on the screen here. It ended up being fairly modest, but any overclock here is useful, and when you're double dipping that with the CPU overclock, we should see some pretty serious performance gains. So without further ado, let's take a look at some results. Right off the bat, huge gains in Oblivion. Biggest thing to note here, we gain over 50% in the 1% low, which does a lot to smooth things out. Big gains again in Fear, and the 1% low of 72 now means that the game never drops below the 70 Hz refresh rate of our monitor. Here's the in-game benchmark comparison. In King's Bounty, we gained 10 frames on the average and about 12% on the 1% minimum. Really nice gains. Closing this off, we saw more massive gains in Need for Speed Underground 2, drawing 20% additional frames on average. So, was overclocking worth it? Well, we gained massive performance for less than a minute's worth of effort. and the only cost was some minor wear and tear on a 20-year-old processor and graphics card that combined cost me less than $30. Yes, it was worth it. If you do like nostalgic content, please consider subscribing. Set a personal goal to try and reach 1,000 subscribers, and any help is appreciated. Until next time, thanks for watching.